Good evening. This is Martin L. Shoemaker presenting the Instant Story Hour, where story comes first. And my lovely and talented assistant tonight is Sean Patrick Hazlett, author and editor. And over to you, Sean.
All right. Well, Martin, it is an absolute pleasure to be on the show. Thank you very much.
And you got a story for us?
Absolutely.
All right, let's do
So
it.
this story is from Weird World War China, which came out in January of this year. And the story is Radioaktivität. In a secluded corner of Fort Meade, Major Julian Skaggs made his way across an open, snowy field. A crisp wind howled as it swept in from the west. Ahead, a massive evergreen flanked two nondescript single-story white buildings, hiding behind a threadbare screen of oak. Built during World War II, the structure's edifices were stained with the soot of age. Testaments to the military's focus on function over form, the buildings had one primary purpose: not to draw attention to the people or activity inside them. With mangy black hair, jeans, and a bulky members-only jacket, Skaggs looked like any old schlep off the street, unless the observer knew what to look for. His wiry frame and careful movements would have told them that he was anything but ordinary. Skaggs covered the distance quickly, anxious to get to his next assignment. Finding Muammar Gaddafi's location in support of Operation El Dorado Canyon had been a bust. Something had blocked Skaggs' perception, and on several subsequent targets, he'd been off. He needed a win, and fast. Otherwise, the DIA's Directorate for Science and Technology would probably send him back to the Army, where the Green Machine would shove him into some regimental S2 shop. There, he'd waste away moving plastic North Koreans on a giant map or get skull-fucked by the big green weenie for incorrectly analyzing a boot print in a pile of DMZ night soil. No, fuck that, he thought. He was going to get a win, and he would do whatever it took to make that happen. He headed toward the larger building on his left, the headquarters of the Defense Intelligence Agency's DS-T remote viewing unit. He typed in his access code at the front door and entered the facility. To his chagrin, his civilian boss, Dr. Alvin Nowak, was waiting for him in the hallway. Nowak's expressionless demeanor betrayed nothing about what the man was thinking. For a remote viewing unit, it was maddening. The man adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose and said, "Major Skaggs, I have a very special project for you today." Then he turned and started walking toward his office. The man's matter-of-fact delivery betrayed nothing, meant nothing, suggested nothing. Major Skaggs could find himself doing anything from a coffee run to a short-term field assignment in Nicaragua supporting Operational Detachment Delta. He couldn't read a damn thing from the man's humorless face. So like a good officer, Skaggs just nodded and followed his boss. When Skaggs entered the room, he immediately noticed it was much dimmer than usual. Dr. Nowak sat down, adjusted his blood-red tie, and said, "Close the door." He motioned for Skaggs to take a seat in front of Nowak's mahogany desk. The good doctor folded his hands, then stared directly into Skaggs' eyes for 10 uncomfortable seconds. To fill the awkward silence, Skaggs felt a nearly insurmountable urge to speak, but he knew better than that. Nowak would most certainly use anything Skaggs said against him. So it was best to stay silent, especially given all the rumors about the man's involvement in several CIA black projects associated with the occult, stretching all the way back to the 60s and 70s. Some whispered that Nowak had worked closely with members of the Thule Society, who the Army had extracted from Germany as part of Operation Paperclip. The scuttlebutt was Nowak had concluded disturbing experiments on unsuspecting American citizens. Experiments so unnerving he'd allegedly gotten thrown out of the agency after the infamous Church Committee hearings in the mid-70s. "Major Skaggs," Dr. Nowak said, carefully enunciating each word, "your results are less than satisfactory." Skaggs felt a lump in his throat. "Well, yes, sir, about that." Dr. Nowak held up his right index finger. "Hold on, I'm not finished, and it's doctor, not sir." Skaggs shut his mouth and meekly nodded. I was going to send you back to a regular Army unit, but another government agency requested you by name for a very specific mission. The major desperately wanted to know which agency, but Skaggs knew better than to speak unless Dr. Nowak specifically invited him to. So he waited for the doctor to finish. Dr. Nowak glanced over his right shoulder, then his left, then back again at Skaggs. Skaggs was surprised to see two tall men dressed in black suits and wearing fedoras. Cloaked in shadow, they had been standing there the entire time. Even in the darkness, they wore shades. These two gentlemen have an assignment for you, Nowak said. This special access program is separate from Project Sunstreak, and you are not, under any circumstances, to share the mission's details with any of your colleagues. Understood, Skaggs said. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of one of the men's faces. It was pale and skeletal. For a brief instant, Skaggs felt nauseated, but couldn't quite figure out why. Dr. Nowak snapped his fingers in Skaggs's face. Major, look at me. Ignore them. Your assignment will involve a mixture of remote viewing as well as some limited field work. This assignment is of the most sensitive nature. There are very few men and women alive who have the knowledge of this special access program. You could count the bigot list on the fingers of one hand. Skaggs nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on Dr. Nowak. One of the men handed Nowak a smooth, cylindrical ivory container with a lid. The doctor accepted the item from the man's gloved hand without looking back. Figures adorned in togas and other regalia, reminiscent of ancient Greece, decorated the container. The impressions were painted in red and black, but it was the image on the lid that caught Skaggs's eye. It was like gazing into a mirror, only it wasn't a mirror. It was a face that could have been Skaggs's twin. Before he left for Thermopylae, Leonidas gifted this pyxis to his wife, Nowak said matter-of-factly. It looks as if it were made yesterday, Skaggs said. Nowak stared directly into Skaggs's eyes. That's because it was. What do you mean? Skaggs asked, now deeply curious. Ignoring the question, Nowak pulled a slip of parchment from the artifact. A series of 8 Arabic numerals, a number system that didn't exist in ancient Greece, were scrawled onto its surface. These are your coordinates, Nowak said. Put everything else aside and provide me with a full write-up of what you see by tomorrow afternoon. Skaggs nodded. It was protocol to receive nothing but an 8-digit number for a target. Providing any other detail about it would make it more difficult for a remote viewer to objectively describe it. Any scrap of information beyond the coordinates might tempt that viewer to pull everything he or she knew about the target from their mental Rolodex or imagination, which could negatively impact results. The best way to work with the subconscious was to know as little as possible about the target, other than the coordinates that represented that target's gestalt. What was odd, though, was the presence of the strange artifact. So strange, in fact, that despite Dr. Nowak's apparent limited tolerance for questions, Skaggs felt compelled to ask another question. Is there anything significant about that artifact I should know for my session? No, Dr. Nowak said. More information will be forthcoming once you complete this initial assignment. Got it, Skaggs replied. Thank you, Doctor. As Skaggs rose and turned to leave, Nowak interrupted him. Oh, and Skaggs? Yes, Doctor? After you repeat the 8 digits at the beginning of your first session, I want you to say the following. Tune into the memory. Before he could stop himself, Skaggs said, What? Tune into the memory, Nowak repeated, as if to hammer home the point. Tune into the memory, Skaggs said. Got it. Skaggs left, now more confused than ever. Tune into the memory. In the adjacent building to the one where he'd received his coordinates, Skaggs sat at a rectangular table in a dimly lit room. He grabbed a single sheet of blank paper from an inch-thick stack on his left.
No color.
He read the target's coordinates aloud, then recited Dr. Nowak's peculiar mantra. Tune into the memory. On the left side of the page, Skaggs quickly jotted down the target's coordinates and let his subconscious push his pen across the sheet to form a signal line. A series of images buffeted his thoughts. He never had perceptions this crisp or clear. He felt chaotic motion as if the ground were shifting violently beneath his feet. He could smell smoke and burning meat. He heard screams. His perceptions came at him so fast he struggled to record them all. A majestic red structure collapsed into the ocean. It gave him a strong impression of the Golden Gate Bridge. He quickly classified the vision as an analytical overlay to ensure his mental interpretation didn't corrupt his session. He continued to watch buildings and other structures quake and crumble. Without warning, there was a dark stillness. His perception telescoped upward into the stratosphere. When he looked down, he saw the unmistakable contours of California as it shattered and flooded moments after a tsunami had claimed its fractured ruins. Then his consciousness was flung further forward in time. An Asian man of relatively advanced age, in a black suit with red tie and wearing a jade half mask covering the right side of his face, sat at the front of a large auditorium where he held court among half-starved masses. A cordon of Chinese soldiers kept him a safe distance from the desperate crowd. Behind him, a Chinese flag stood above that of California's Bear Flag Republic. With dizzying speed, Skaggs's vision catapulted forward again. A family of barely animated and shivering cadavers shambled forward through an ash-covered mountain pass. Skaggs's gut grumbled in sympathy with their intense hunger. Two emaciated children and their desperate parents struggled uphill through mountains peppered with smoldering fires. The melted hulks of tanks and armored personnel carriers littered their path. In the smoky distance, soldiers wearing helmets and gas masks and dressed in gray environmental suits ushered the refugees toward a shimmering pale blue light into which they disappeared. And besides these men stood a single metallic sign rattling in the cold that said radioactivity. Skaggs immediately ended his session. His heart pounded. His face was slick with sweat. What the hell was that? To center himself, he took a deep breath, then set about wrapping up his session summary. In his analytical mind, his visions made no logical sense. They were all over the place. But one thing was constant. An oppressive cloud of hopelessness overshadowed everything. Deep in his gut, he knew what he'd seen had been quite real. Yet he would prefer to lose his billet here than for those visions to become true. Dr. Nowak, I'd like to offer an apology, Skaggs said, placing his session notes on his boss's desk. But I don't think I had such a great session. Nowak adjusted his spectacles. Is that so? He grabbed the session notes and leafed through the material. He stopped and looked back up at Skaggs, giving the Major an inscrutable look, then said, in that notion, Major Skaggs, you are most assuredly mistaken. Huh? Skaggs said, because the scroll with your target coordinates mentioned you by name and described what you would see. You saw your face on its lid, did you not? Wait, what? Skaggs tried to keep his comments to a minimum. Why? The experience seemed so surreal that it could only be a test. Reality is not precisely linear, Nowak said cryptically. So you see, you are not only the right man for this job, but also you are the exact man. Do you have a sense of what I'm supposed to be looking for? Skaggs ventured. Yes, Nowak replied, then stared at Skaggs from across the mahogany desk. Skaggs stood there and waited for Nowak to say more. Now that you've confirmed what this scroll predicted, Nowak continued, you are to proceed to the next coordinates. Okay. I would like you to do another session this evening. Then leave your write-up on my desk before tomorrow morning. Time, however flexible it may be, is of the essence. Skaggs tightened his jaw. Nowak's apparent refusal to share information along with his order to do a double shift were aggravating. Yes, sir, Skaggs said, then dutifully wrote down the coordinates. As Skaggs turned to leave, Nowak said, yes, doctor, and don't forget to repeat the mantra. Skaggs again faced Nowak. Tune into the memory. Exactly, Nowak said. All business. A single Asian man stood in the way of a tank column moving through a massive concrete square. The lead tank attempted to drive around him, but the civilian moved with it, denying it access to the plaza beyond. Then it was night. A battalion of soldiers arrived on armored personnel carriers and streamed into the square. A crowd of unarmed civilians, many barely older than adolescents, opposed them. The massacre that followed was difficult to observe. It was even tougher when Skaggs felt the protesters' fear and despair. They reeked of death. Again, his visions were clearer than they'd ever been. He was certain this was China in the near future, but where he could not guess. Before he could catch his breath, his consciousness was yanked backward in time. It was a misty morning over a dense primeval forest. Its mountainous highlands were lush with fir and pine, white birch, oak, and beech peppered the lowlands' undulating hills. Skaggs could feel a slight chill in the air. As if waking from a dream, something flashed in the gray morning sky. The clouds glowed as if they'd been bombarded with white phosphorus. Then Skaggs saw it, a silvery disk streaking across the heavens at an unimaginable speed. An explosion followed, burning a hole into the hitherto peaceful forest. An unseen force nudged Skaggs slightly forward in time. A group of soldiers stood around a silvery disk, their mouths agape in wonder. They pointed at the object and spoke to one another in German. Skaggs's consciousness shifted again still. This time, he estimated he'd moved ahead several years. The same silver craft rested in a massive hangar. Regiments of German soldiers stood in review as two very young men in World War II-era SS uniforms entered the object. Moments later, the craft began to wobble, then levitate. Slowly, it floated out of the hangar, then zipped into the atmosphere. In an instant, it was gone. A moment later, the craft hovered back into the hangar. The soldiers remained at attention. From a place with no discernible seams on the craft, a cavity opened and two men exited. In his mind's eye, Skaggs looked deeper. He noticed that these were not the same men who had entered the craft minutes earlier. They seemed at least 1 or 2 generations older. One man's hair was white with age. The other was completely bald. But as Skaggs peered closer still, he noticed similarities between the men who had entered the craft and the two who now stood before the German regiment. Then the realization of what he saw crashed down upon him like a demolition of the Empire State Building. These were the same men, only creaking with the disease of age. How was that possible? Skaggs frantically scribbled down his impressions. Filled with words, he pushed the sheet aside, grabbed another, and continued to furiously capture what he experienced. He shifted in space, but curiously not in time, and found himself amongst the smoldering remains of a 1940s New York, then Chicago, then Los Angeles, San Francisco, Dallas, Kansas City, Las Vegas, and on and on and on. His consciousness spiraled backward in time in what felt like an impossible stretch of infinity. From space, Skaggs beheld a beautiful blue and green world that looked hauntingly similar to Earth, only instead of 7 continents, a single massive land mass coiled around the globe like a serpent. On its dark side, a vast array of lights dotted the planet's surface. Something drew him downward. In moments, he found himself among great dark columns that spiraled upward in counter-rotating sinuous patterns that reminded him of a double helix structure. Thousands of cloaked saurian bipeds passed between the columns. The reptilians hummed an eerie melody that made the very air vibrate in sympathy. Then came thunder and lightning. The earth quaked, and the columns wobbled until they collapsed into dust. The very air burned with the intensity of a supernova. Skaggs winked back into outer space, where he witnessed a great pillar of light atomize the once great civilization. Again and again, some hidden power propelled him far forward in time as the mighty continent sundered and churned. Tectonic plates crashed upon one another, giving rise to a massive tsunami that swept across the continent, destroying all in its wake. The scarred wounds of the lizard people's annihilated city remained fixed in his vision as a shimmering eye of concentric circles. As the passage of time seemed to decelerate, the vast rings of West Africa's reshot structure were all that remained of that shining city. His mind's eye narrowed its focus onto a hidden cavern nestled into the folds of the encroaching desert, and in that cavern was a translucent diamond tablet, and chiseled on that tablet was a set of coordinates Skaggs could not read through remote viewing. A week later, Skaggs was on a flight to Nouakchott, the Mauritanian capital. It was the city's largest city and deepwater port on the eastern Atlantic rim. As Skaggs stepped out of the plane, the Western Sahara's simmering heat washed over him. All around, through a kaleidoscopic prism of floating grains of sand, stood the great tent city of Nouakchott. Not a single building rose higher than 1 story. Skaggs sighed in relief that he and the 4 Delta operators wouldn't be spending much time among those desperate masses of humanity. Instead, the team would trek northeast through the western desert for over 600 clicks in 3 Land Rovers carrying nothing but water and fuel. The Delta operators had also arranged for 3 Berber guides to smooth their passage through any tribes they might encounter on their journey to the eye of the Sahara. As dangerous as the expedition might be, operating in the city would have been far worse, especially since it had only been 2 years since Colonel Mayoya Oud Sid Ahmad Taya had deposed his rival, Colonel Muhammad Kuna Oud Haidala. The new boss was very keen on maintaining his tenuous control over his sparse desert nation. Mauritania was the last nation on earth to abolish slavery in 1981, but according to U.S. intelligence, the slaves were still very much active. Running into them was something Skaggs was very keen to avoid. All but one Delta operator drove each of the 3 Land Rovers, while the fourth, a chiseled man of medium height who went by the name Bill, sat shotgun in the lead vehicle. From there, he directed their infiltration into the lonely Sahel. A Berber guide also accompanied each vehicle. In the second Land Rover, Skaggs sat next to the driver, a laconic southerner who went by the name Lance. The trucks rattled through the late afternoon and into the evening. The temperature dropped quickly, and Skaggs shivered in the encroaching darkness. At twilight, Lance powered up his AN-PVS-5 night vision goggles to avoid switching on his headlights and drawing any unwanted attention. As the covert caravan meandered through the open desert, Skaggs was struck by how quiet it was. At the same time, there was so little ambient light, he could clearly see an infinity of stars above. The long, lonely journey gave Skaggs time to think, time to reflect on why he had traveled across the Atlantic to acquire an artifact he'd seen only in his mind's eye. And based on that fragment of trained intuition, the U.S. military was willing to gamble on Skaggs' impression and support the mission by sending 4 of the U.S. military's most lethal operators. And yet Skaggs had this strange but utter certainty that his hunch was anything but one. The artifact was the key, a key to a gate he had yet to uncover. Navigating through the empty desert through the eerie green light of his MVGs, Lance slowed the Land Rover to a near crawl, then stopped. He turned to Skaggs and said, "Wait here." Lance grabbed his Car 15 rifle and left the truck, running forward to the lead vehicle. The Berber guide behind him just stared blankly at Skaggs, as if oblivious to the sense of danger Skaggs felt rising in the distance. Moments later, Lance returned to the Land Rover and whispered something in Arabic to the Berber. The Berber replied, shaking his head emphatically. Lance paused for an instant, then pointed at Skaggs. "Grab your rifle. Someone else is camped about a click from here who shouldn't be." Skaggs stared at Lance, dumbfounded. "Wait, we're going to assault 3 people? How do we know it isn't a Berber encampment?" Lance jerked his thumb toward the guide. "Because our friend here insists none of his people are in the area." "But how do we know there aren't just a bunch of unlucky tourists?" Skaggs pressed. "Because our intel no one shared with you, indicates the Chinese are operating in this region." "The Chinese? I thought you were going to say the Soviets. Why the hell would they be all the way out here?" "That's need to know. And all you need to know is they're hostile." Again, Lance pointed at Skaggs' rifle. Skaggs had been in this game long enough to know not to push any further, so he grabbed his weapon and MVGs, then crept out into the night. The encampment was
a stop point.
Okay.
That is making me wonder how much your head hurts. You jumped around to so many scenes and time and space and everything and tied it all together into one continuous stream.
Yeah.
It's like that would make my head hurt.
Well, it ties up in the end. That's the beauty of
Yeah.
the story, but you're not gonna, you don't really get it without that. But
yeah, but you did so good with all the history setting with all of it that you could put people there, and there were the hints to tell what historical events were going on that he doesn't even know yet. Now, some of them were outside of our scope, but
right.
but a lot of them you were tying in that, yeah, that's there, that's real, this makes sense.
Yeah, I did. And the other thing is I only mentioned a year once, right? I noticed as I was rereading it that there's no clear, they don't come out and tell the audience exactly which year it is, but you should be able to pick it up from context clues.
Mm-hmm.
Or roughly the time period, the decade. You would be able to get the decade right.
Yeah. Now, you said this is part of Weird World War China. So let's mention briefly, that's book 3 in the series, correct?
That's right.
So we had, your first one was Weird World War 3.
Mm-hmm.
And then
World War 4. and
then
then
China.
this one.
Yep. For our audience who's not in on this, these aren't all Sean's stories. Sean is the editor for these anthologies that he has invited people in to bring in stories and some of his own as well. I'm in on this partly because I have had the privilege to be in all three so far.
And and this is the only one I'm in. The previous two I don't have any stories on.
But this story sounds a little familiar to me. Is this lead into your novel you've been planning, or is it just very similar premise?
It's similar premise, but it's less hard science fiction, more occult in combination with some science fiction, right?
Okay.
The novel is strictly, well, I shouldn't say strictly, but so far it's strictly hard science fiction.
Okay. I know that too was about an artifact and an expedition to retrieve it and things going horribly, horribly wrong. Because that's where the story comes in, of course.
Yeah, just think of Xenophon's 10,000, right? Where they, they're in Russia, they're in Russia, in the Russian Far East, which is right next to Siberia, and China eventually invades Russia to also try to get this artifact, and these guys are kind of stuck behind enemy lines, and they have to survive in some of the most brutal conditions on the planet, while at the same time evading Russian Spetsnaz folks, as well as Chinese infantry battalions and whatever landed.
Mm-hmm. So they're in the intersection of a lot of bad stuff.
That's right.
Now, another part of this one that struck me very, very concrete and believable is the military environment. And of course, that's your background as a tank warrior. So I felt like you really made the whole chain of command and the whole office and the need to know and just the whole experience of him dealing with the higher ups felt very concrete to me. Like,
Well, that unit,
different breeding,
the unit that he's in, that was a real unit. Like Project Sunstreak, that was a real special access program. The description of the offices, those were real offices on Fort Meade. I've seen pictures of them, but having talked to people who were in that original unit. So it's based, the story is not based on anything that happened, but the unit was a real unit that existed back in the 80s and 90s.
I felt like that you did a really good job of grounding me in the setting. Now, we got just a little time left, but I want to make sure you had a chance to plug your podcast, because for folks who aren't in the know, Sean's got a pretty big podcast that he's been doing now for how long? 5 years?
2.5 years.
Okay. And I was privileged to be a guest, but that was a long time back.
You were the very first guest, actually.
Oh, yeah.
So Through a Glass Darkly is where military science fiction and fact meets the paranormal. So it's very much like Weird World War III, that whole series. But it's also delves into real people who've had real experiences. So to give you an example, are you familiar with Dr. Avi Loeb?
Only through your podcast.
Oh, he used to run Harvard's astronomy department. Like
So the name pops up.
Yeah, he worked on he's the first foreigner to work on a project for the Strategic Defense Initiative back in the 80s. But I just interviewed him. That's going to appear this Monday. But there's a lot of folks that I talked to, all the, not all, but many of the original folks who were in that remote viewing program that I just talked about, that was featured in the story. So like, these are real people who, like, our government did some really weird stuff, and it's real. That's kind of what I do interviews on those sorts of things. So
very fun.
Yeah. So Through a Glass Darkly with Sean, that's the podcast.
Okay. So I encourage people to go out and take a look at Sean's writing. He is generally a whole lot darker than me. Sean and I could never really collaborate because we are in different zones of the emotional space. That one time when Sean did a critique of one of my stories, on about page 3, he said, "If this happens, I'm going to be really disappointed." And that was exactly what happened, because Sean wanted the story to turn really dark, and I wanted the story to end optimistically. So if you'd like,
get ready, buddy. Get ready.
If you like your stories to have grim, foreboding, ambiguous, and dark endings, look for Sean's work. Well, all right. So we are at the instant story show part of this, where you have, I hope, a prompt for me, and I will turn that into a story, or to be more precise, a story opening, because we probably don't have time for me to finish it unless it's a really short idea. But I will do my best to improvise a story from what you have for me. So what do we got?
Okay. So the CIA's Office of Special Access organizes highly classified crash retrievals of extraterrestrial objects that land various places in the globe. It is, they borrow people from Delta Force, right? So Operational Detachment Delta. And there's a team that has been dispatched to the jungles of Papua New Guinea. The government doesn't know about it. These people are cleared at a level above top secret, so they have cosmic level clearances, and they stumble across a crash scene. Okay, there is a lenticular shaped UFO that's wedged in the surface. There's an opening. There are no alien bodies. There's no, at least that they can see. So whatever was piling it was piloting it, sorry, escaped. And as they investigate further, they go to a local village, and there are no villagers. All they find are a stack of bodies where their eyes have been removed, their reproductive organs have been removed, their intestines have been removed with laser-like precision. They have to figure out where these things are, apprehend them, capture them at best, and terminate them at worst before a news crew that is in the vicinity investigating the meteorite that came in finds them. They have full authority to shoot to kill anybody that figures out what this thing is. The number one issue is finding whatever landed the craft, which they have no idea what entities they are. They don't know what they look like. And also to prevent the story from getting out.
Okay.
The commander of this mission is Lieutenant Roy Stevens. Or sorry,
Right.
Captain Roy Stevens. Captain Roy Stevens.
Right. I would
US
write
Army.
that. I would write that down, except my keyboard just stopped working. So I can dictate, I can't take notes. So if I forget Roy's name, my apologies. Captain Stevens sat behind his makeshift desk and stared at the medic, period. My apologies, comma. Dragon, naturally speaking, does much better with transcription if I speak my punctuation, period. So it is a habit I have difficulty shaking now, period. All right, comma, Scoggins, comma. What can you tell me? Question mark. Not fucking much, comma, Captain, period. I'm a medic, comma, not a coroner, period. You've set things up really well for me here, period. Given what we brought in, comma, this is not a bad med lab, period. But it's not a morgue, comma, and it's not set up for autopsies, period. Not as if I've ever done one, ... The most I've done is observe, period. New line. Quit telling me your problems, comma, and give me your answers, period. New line. Answers, comma, Captain, question mark. Here's what I know, period. This was not trauma, period. There's no sign that any of these people were injured, period. They seem to have just ... fallen asleep, question mark. Voluntarily laid down for the operation, question mark. This was ... Captain, comma, this was practically art, period. The cuts are laser sharp, ... and yes, comma, I mean that literally, ... and the tissue damage, aside from the incisions themselves, is 0, period, or as close as I can tell, period. New line. And, question mark, new line. Captain, comma, that's just not possible, period. New line. It must be possible, comma, if that's what you observed, period. New line. No, comma, Captain, ... All right, comma, let me use just one example, period. Their eyeballs are missing, period. Severed from the muscles and the retinas and all the attachments in back, period. Do you know how hard it would be to do that without pulling the eyeball out to get at that, question mark? And how impossible it would be to do that without any damage on every single one of the 7 corpses I've investigated so far, question mark? This is not just mysterious, comma, it can't happen, period. New line. And yet it did, period. New line. Captain, comma, this seems just beyond me, period. We need to get a real team in here, comma, with real coroners, comma, real doctors, period. New line. Captain checked his chronometer, period. There ain't no way in hell there's time for that, period. I figure from reports we've got maybe 4 hours to get everything wrapped up and done, period. To get evidence buried, period. To blow up the mountain over top of that saucer thing, comma, so that it's buried, period. And get safely out of sight, comma, because nothing attracts a journo's curiosity like a military team evacuating as they show up, period. So we have to be long gone before that flight gets in, period. New line. Coggins shook his head, period. If that's what we have to do, comma, Captain, comma, we might as well accept mission failure now, comma, and get to hiding the bodies, period. We're not going to be able to get that done in this time frame, period. New line. The captain stared at the medic, period. I'm going to pretend you didn't say that, period. We do not give up on the mission while there's time to proceed, period. New line. Yes, comma, Captain, period. New line. All right, comma, get back to your lab, comma, and get to work, period. If there's any way anyone can help, comma, you have my authority to commandeer them, period. Except for Tyler and Reese, period. They're coming with me, period. New line. New line. The captain and his 2 aides returned to the big disc, period. The guard outside stood nervously at attention, comma, rifle gripped in his hands, comma, ready to plug anything that moved, period. The captain could see that the man was extremely nervous, period. And who really could blame him? Question mark. When they'd been told their mission, dash dash, under highest classification, dash dash, it had still seemed like a dream, period, like fiction, period. The men had accepted it, comma, just because of the bars on the shoulders of the men who'd sent them, period. You did not argue with that many stars all lined up, period. New line. But they hadn't believed it, period. Not like seeing this island off of Papua would make you believe it, period. This place with all the dead bodies, comma, a whole lost village, comma, and a goddamn flying saucer buried in the ground, period. New line. Stefan, comma, we're going in, comma, he said, period. New line. Stefan jerked at that, period. Captain, comma, do you need me, dash dash, new line. If I need you, comma, I'll order you, comma, soldier, period. New line. Yes, comma, sir, comma, but, dash dash, new line. But nothing, period. This is my decision, comma, it's made, comma, now get the hell out of our way, period. New line. The man stepped aside, comma, letting go of his rifle long enough to snap a salute, comma, and the captain led his aides in, period. New line. The interior wasn't huge, period. It was nothing like, comma, say, comma, that ship in Close Encounters, period. The interior was about the size of maybe a battleship, period, maybe less, period. Room enough for a small crew, comma, if they were human sized, period. They were probably smaller, comma, based on the size of the corridors, period. All of the soldiers had to duck walking through, comma, so the occupants of the ship had to be little green men, comma, so to speak, period. The troops had already investigated this thing front to end, comma, but found nothing that was particularly helpful for understanding where it came from, how it worked, or the purpose, period. And certainly no one knew where the crew were, period. New line. But these two, comma, his best technicians, comma, thought they might have one more plan, period. This way, comma, captain, period. They led him through the upper shaft into the top, dash dash, assuming top and bottom meant anything, comma, and this wasn't a free fall ship, dash dash, the top of the vehicle, period. There, the ramp opened up into a large round room, comma, with discs set all along the wall in a great circle, period. New line. The technician, and I forget his name, so we're going to call him Sam. Sam said, comma, Captain, comma, let's look at these discs, period. New line. You looked at them before, period. New line. Yes, comma, but we hadn't considered that we might be thinking too much like human engineers, period. That there might be another way to open these, period. New line. You're sure they're open? They will open? Question mark. New line. They're hollow when we tap on them, period. New line. So what is this new way? Question mark. New line. Captain, comma, look really closely here, period. He pointed at little dots along the ring of the disc, period. They're very small, comma, but they're dash dash new line. Yes, comma, reflective, period. New line. They might be sensors, period. Sensitive to some kind of light, period. New line. Interesting, period. He checked his chronometer again, period. And how will you figure out what kind of light in the time we have available? Question mark. It's under 3 hours, comma, you know, period. New line. Captain, comma, we're going to hit it with everything, period. We have some broad spectrum light sources that we can adjust. We've got a variety, period. We think that if we can get the right frequency, comma, we can open one of these up, period. And we're about 15 minutes in, and I've been going along at a pretty good clip. So this is your opportunity to throw me a curveball now. If you got something
the technician inadvertently bumps into one of the plates.
Okay.
The craft starts to hum.
Okay.
And then the captain's heart kind of drops. And then the humming suddenly stops. One of the other soldiers goes to look outside. It's dark and it smells different. It's pitch black. He steps outside. The ground is moist. He hears things dripping as if from a ceiling. The captain wonders, where the hell are we now?
All right. Good curveball.
Oh, and by the way, he hears something that sounds like a cross between a trumpet and an elephant echoing in the distance.
Okay. Sir, comma, back inside, comma, now. Exclamation point. Sam said, period, new line. What? Dash dash, new line. Sam must have been spooked, comma, because he didn't wait, period. He grabbed the captain's arm, comma, and dragged him back inside, period. Captain, comma, we don't know what's out there, comma, but whatever it is, comma, we must assume hostile, period. Better to be wrong on the side of caution than to get eaten by whatever's out there, period. New line. The captain was going to argue, comma, but the man was speaking sense, period. This mission was secret, comma, and there were people after it, period. He should assume hostile intention, comma, or at least someone investigating that they didn't want finding it, period. So yes, comma, they needed to be inside, period. New line. But, ... What the fuck, question mark? How do we get from there to here, dash dash, wherever here is, dash dash, in an eye blink, question mark, new line. Captain, comma, we ain't going to answer that in 3 hours, comma, or 3 days, comma, or probably 30 years, period. But the more important question for me is, how do we get back, question mark, new line. The captain said, comma, I'm not sure we should, period, new line. Huh, question mark, new line. Our primary mission was to hide this from foreign powers and from nosy journalists, period. Can you think of a way to make it any more hidden? Question mark. New line. Captain, I'm all for fulfilling the mission, comma, but I'd like to see my home again, period. New line. You've never faced the potential to not come home from a mission? Question mark. New line. Yeah, comma, but if I took a bullet, comma, I wouldn't care, period. I didn't take a bullet, comma, I took a trip to Alpha Centauri, period. New line. What makes you think that, period? New line. Damn it, comma, Captain, comma, don't be so literal, exclamation point. We are someplace else through somewhere, someone, somehow else, comma, and we really can't know how far we've gone, period. The other technician, call him Ross, added, comma, Captain, comma, there is no way in any known physics for us to have done this through our space, period. We must have gone through some sort of hypothetical higher space, period. And if that's the case, comma, we don't know how connected things are, period. It is entirely possible for 2 points that are 10 million light years apart in our space to be connected by a shunt that's fair microns in that higher space, period. We simply don't know the geometry, period. So we might as well call it Alpha Centauri as anything, period, or just call it this goddamn place, period. New line. All right, comma, we're in this goddamn place, period. First order of business is keeping whatever's out there, period. Second order of business is can we eat, can we breathe, dash, dash. New line. Sam said, comma, we just did, comma, sir, period. New line. Ross added, comma, and that was really dumb, period. At the point where we knew we weren't there, comma, we didn't know what here would be, period. Sam shook his head, period. The port was open, period. If the air was poison, we would already be dead, period. Whatever else we know, comma, we can breathe out there, period. New line. For how long? Question mark. Who knows what toxins are building up inside us? Question mark. New line. The captain stared at both of them, comma, and said, comma, then let's close that damn hatch before it gets any worse, period. New line. They investigated the hatch, period. There were no wheels, comma, no levers, comma, no buttons, comma, just more of the little tiny reflective dots, period. Sam once again pulled out his little light bank of different spectral tubes, comma, and started rapidly flipping through different frequency combinations, period. The captain was almost ready to tell him to give up when the hatch closed, period. New line. Sam and Ross grinned at each other, period. It worked! Exclamation point. New line. The captain shook his head, period. You're surprised? Question mark. You based all of this on a guess? Question mark. New line. Uneducated theory, comma, captain, comma, Ross said, period. The technique is obvious, period. We could do it today, comma, but no one's seen any need, period. But it's easier for them, apparently, comma. So that's the secret to this technology, apparently, period. New line. All right, comma, then, comma, you two have a job ahead of you, period. New line. Sam said, comma, what? Question mark. We need to find every one of those dots through the ship, comma, label them, comma, and carefully experiment to find out what they do. Period. I don't know what happens next, comma, but we're going to need to get control of this ship before we can make any further plans. Period. And that takes me to 54 minutes, which is close enough to my 55 mark that I think it's a good stopping point.
I think it's a great stopping point.
It's a great stopping point. I like this one. It's got me off in a really bizarre direction.
That's how I roll, my friend.
Yeah. So I am running behind on these because work has been insane, and I've also got to do the recording and so on. I have got episode 1 finished and needs to be transcribed. Episode 4 is in the middle of dictating what comes next, but that one was insane. Was that episode? No, I think you're 4. That was, yeah, I think you're 4. That was episode 3. Episode 2 is going to take me some time because I promised the audience it would be a murder mystery, and I haven't even gotten to the murder yet. So that one's going to end up being a little bit of a longer one because first I have to have a murder, and then I have to have investigations, then I have to have suspects and red herrings, and then I have to have clues, and so that one's going to take a while. But I'll put this in the queue for finishing up, and it will go out to my mailing list, and of course you'll get the result as well. I have no clue where this one is going. With the mystery one, it's like, okay, I can see that this is a mystery. I can see who the victim's going to be, and so I could see where that one's going. This one and the one last week with Mona Lisa, I was drawing on influences from my youth, so I kind of had a vision where it was going. This one, I am just no idea where it's going. We are lost in space, except hopefully a little bit better than lost in space.
Yeah, you're lost in a cavern somewhere. Who knows where it is?
It might not have gone anywhere off Earth. We really don't know.
You have no idea. Yeah, no idea.
And I will find out the fun way. So. All right. So I appreciate your time and your reading. Fantastic story, people. Look for Weird World War China. You will also find perhaps one of the most violent stories I have yet written in that one. I tend to write fights that last about 1 shot long because I feel like in the real world, if you're trying to kill somebody, it happens fast. You kill them or they kill you, especially one-on-one. But I extended these battles just for the sake of trying to please the audience. And then pick up the rest of the series and look for more from Sean. Maybe you've got another Weird World War coming sometime. So next week, let me check my schedule really quickly here. Next week, we will have Stephanie Talent, who is a Writers of the Future winner from Volume 40. And we will, hey, my keyboard is back. Yay. We will have her reading from her work and giving me yet another prompt to riff off. So, and go back here, check things here. All right. We've got a couple minutes yet to finish off. So any last words, Sean?
Just it was fun doing this, and check out my podcast. There's more of these sorts of topics, only they're real in many cases. And that's about it.
All right. Then I thank you all, and I wish everyone a good night, and you will see this. Well, by the time you see this, it will already be transcribed and recorded and up on YouTube. So looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.